Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. When sensitivity is not the problem, but structure is. There are moments in life when a single criticism feels like an emotional earthquake. One sentence, one raised eyebrow, one moment of silence can shake you to your core as if your entire worth were suddenly placed on trial. Many people live in this fragile space where rejection, even small, subtle, accidental, feels catastrophic. They find themselves spiraling into self-doubt, questioning their value, their competence, their right to exist unharmed. Society often mislabels this experience as being too sensitive, implying that the problem lies in feeling too deeply. You might have been told to toughen up, stop overreacting, ignore what people say. But these suggestions never address the real issue, because the real issue is not sensitivity at all. The real issue is structure. Carl Jung called this inner fragility a permeable ego, a psychic condition in which the boundaries between your inner world and outer world are thin, unstable, and easily violated. When these boundaries are weak, everything comes straight in. Words pierce you like arrows. Opinions enter without filters. Rejections feel like personal annihilation. You are not too sensitive. Your inner structure was never allowed to fully form. This is not a matter of weakness. Jung never saw it that way. Instead, he saw interrupted development. He understood that many people grow into adulthood having never built a psychological armor, not because they lack the capacity, but because they were never given the conditions to develop one. A child cannot build emotional resilience in an environment where love is conditional, where approval must be earned, where mistakes are treated as evidence of inadequacy. If your emotions were dismissed, mocked, or punished, your internal world learned a simple rule. My feelings are not trustworthy. If you grew up walking on emotional eggshells, constantly adjusting to the moods of others, you learned another rule. My worth depends on how others respond to me. These lessons do not politely disappear in adulthood. They sink into the psyche and shape how the adult self operates. That adult might be impressive on the outside, successful, responsible, admired, but internally they are built on sand. Without a solid internal structure, they remain vulnerable to every shift in external feedback. A compliment lifts them. A criticism destroys them. Silence terrifies them. They live like mirrors, reflecting others' judgments, unable to hold themselves together when winds of disapproval blow. The tragedy is that society keeps telling them to stop caring instead of teaching them how to build what they never received, an ego strong enough to withstand pressure without collapsing. A healthy ego, Jung explained, is not rigid or narcissistic. It is a flexible armor, strong but breathable. Its purpose is not to make you invulnerable or disconnected, but to allow you to remain yourself in the presence of opposition, ambiguity, or rejection. With a healthy ego, you can hear criticism without turning it into self-condemnation. You can be rejected without concluding that you are worthless. You can feel strong emotions without being swept away by them. But how do you reach that point if your structure was not formed when it should have been? You begin exactly here, by understanding that emotional fragility is not a personality flaw. It is not evidence that you are weak or defective. It is evidence that your internal scaffolding was never built. It is the result of experiences in which your authentic self was not allowed to exist freely. You learn to adapt rather than develop, to survive rather than become, to protect rather than express. This is why Jung emphasized that the ego is not something you are born with fully shaped. It must be constructed, differentiated, strengthened. And the first step in this construction is recognizing that your sensitivity is not your enemy. It is your system's attempt to stay alive in a world that never taught you how to protect yourself. In this journey, we will begin building the structure you were denied. Piece by piece, you will learn how to form psychological boundaries, how to separate your identity from others' opinions, how to stand in your own center rather than in the shifting reflections around you. The goal is not to become hardened or indifferent. The goal is to become solid, able to remain open, vulnerable and human without being shattered by every gust of external turbulence. This will not be a light journey, but if you have lived long enough at the mercy of other people's reactions, then the time has come to claim your autonomy. You were not born fragile. You simply were not given the tools to grow strong. Now we begin building them together. False armors. The illusions that keep you weak. When a person grows up without a solid internal structure, they develop ways to survive that look like strength from the outside, but are in truth fragile substitutes for real resilience. Jung observed that when the ego is permeable and underdeveloped, it tries to protect itself through defenses that appear hard but are hollow. These defenses are what we commonly mistake for confidence, independence, or toughness. Yet beneath them lies fear. Fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being seen, fear of breaking apart. The first false armor is defensive arrogance. This is not genuine self-worth, but a theatrical performance of invulnerability. Instead of feeling small, the person exaggerates their importance. Instead of risking vulnerability, they hide behind sarcasm, cold detachment, or intellectual superiority. They seem impenetrable, but their so-called strength collapses instantly when confronted with even mild criticism. This arrogance is a brittle shell, masking an inner voice terrified of being exposed as not enough. It is not power, it is panic wearing a mask. Another common disguise is social isolation. Many people withdraw not because they love solitude or peace, but because the emotional world has become too dangerous. They convince themselves that needing no one is strength. They claim independence, but beneath the surface lies deep avoidance. Every relationship feels like a potential wound, so they preemptively retreat. They isolate themselves to feel safe, but this safety is an illusion. The loneliness only reinforces the message that others are threats and that they themselves are too fragile to withstand intimacy. What appears like independence is actually self-protection born out of fear. Then there is paralyzing perfectionism, one of the most deceptive false shields. A perfectionist does not strive for excellence from joy or self-respect. They strive because they believe that anything short of flawless will reveal their unworthiness. For them, failure is not an event but a verdict on their entire identity. Perfectionism is a prison that disguises itself as discipline. It keeps the person constantly hypervigilant, terrified of making mistakes, because mistakes feel like existential threats. This is not resilience but fragility stretched thin. Another false armor is preemptive aggression. Some people attack first so they cannot be attacked. They use sharp words, harsh tones, or dismissive attitudes to intimidate others and create emotional distance. But this aggression is not real strength. It is a frantic attempt to defend a wounded core. Jung called this neurotic compensation. The psyche exaggerates one trait, strength or dominance, to cover up the opposite trait, vulnerability or fear. It is like a small child standing on tiptoes to appear tall. The aggression is not confidence, it is terror in motion. What all these defenses have in common is simple. They protect the ego only by disconnecting it from others and from itself. They do not heal, they hide. They do not empower, they exhaust. They do not strengthen, they delay the collapse. False armors push people away, and in doing so, also push the self further out of alignment. Instead of forming a strong identity, these defenses create distance, confusion, and emotional chaos. The ego becomes more brittle the more it relies on them. A real psychological armor, Jung taught, is not built from fear, but from differentiation, the ability to distinguish who you truly are from what others think you are. This differentiation is the foundation of a healthy ego. Without it, you live in a constant performance, tailoring your behavior to avoid hurt rather than expressing your authentic self. But here's the important realization. If your current defenses are built from fear, then they are not armor. They are wounds wearing metal. Recognizing this truth is not meant to shame you. It is the first act of liberation. You built these defenses because you needed them. They kept you alive in environments where vulnerability was unsafe. But what once protected you now traps you. You cannot grow while locked inside armor designed for war. And many people, without realizing it, continue living as if they are still in danger long after the threat has passed. The purpose of this chapter is not to judge your defenses, but to illuminate them. to help you see that they are not your true self. They are temporary scaffolds erected around a fragile center, and scaffolds by nature are not meant to be permanent. To build true resilience, you must stop relying on masks and begin constructing a self that can stand without them. This does not begin with force or discipline. It begins with awareness. Once you see your defenses for what they are, you create space for something new to emerge. That something new begins with developing the inner observer, a stable internal witness who can watch your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors without collapsing into them. This observer is the first piece of real armor because it gives you distance from your reactions and clarity about your truth. In the next chapter, we will begin building that observer and laying the first real stone of psychological strength. Awakening the inner observer. The first real step toward strength. Most people move through life believing that their emotions are the same as their identity. If they feel shame, they are shameful. If they feel anger, they are angry. If they feel fear, they are weak. This fusion between emotion and self is one of the defining features of a fragile ego. It leaves the person helpless against every internal storm, tossed around by feelings as if they are absolute truth rather than temporary states. Carl Jung understood that no psychological transformation is possible as long as a person remains fused with their emotional reactions. The first step toward becoming resilient is not to suppress emotions or ignore them. It is to create distance from them. This distance is not avoidance. It is awareness. It is the awakening of what Jung called the observing ego, or simply the inner observer. The inner observer is the part of you that can watch your thoughts and emotions without being consumed by them. It notices. It observes. It sees clearly but does not collapse. It is calm even when your feelings are not. It is steady even when your mind is in chaos. And it is this stable vantage point that becomes the first true layer of psychological armor. Consider how different these two statements feel. I am a failure. A part of me is feeling like a failure right now. The first absorbs you. It defines you. It swallows you whole. The second separates you from your emotion. It creates space. In that space, clarity grows. In that space, truth becomes visible. In that space, the fragile ego begins to strengthen. This shift may seem small, but it is revolutionary. Once you learn to observe your emotional states instead of becoming them, your entire psychological landscape begins to transform. Jung described the observer as the bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. Without it, the unconscious overwhelms you with instinctive reactions: fear, shame, defensiveness, reactivity. With it, you can see these reactions without obeying them. You can feel insecure and still remain grounded. You can feel anger without lashing out. You can feel sadness without sinking into despair. You do not stop feeling. You stop drowning. The fragile ego reacts immediately and automatically. The strong ego responds deliberately. The difference between reaction and response is the presence of the observer. But awakening the observer is not automatic. It must be cultivated through practice. It begins with noticing your internal language. When you say, I am anxious, replace it with, a part of me is feeling anxious. When you say, I am worthless, shift to, I am noticing a thought telling me I am worthless. Each shift is a step towards separation from unconscious patterns. This practice does not suppress emotions, it honors them. Emotions carry information, but they should not dictate identity. The inner observer helps you receive the message without adopting the meaning. People with permeable egos often live at the mercy of emotional winds. A slight criticism becomes an identity crisis. A moment of silence feels like abandonment. A disagreement feels like rejection. Without the observer, everything feels personal, total, and permanent. With the observer awakened, you no longer collapse into every internal or external stimulus. You begin to distinguish between the event and the interpretation, between what happened and what your wounded past tells you it means, between the voice of truth and the voice of fear. The inner observer is your first true home within yourself, a place untouched by external noise. But awakening it also reveals something deeper. Beneath your emotional reactions lies a vast reservoir of unresolved material. Hidden fears, unowned traits, repressed anger, buried desires. the parts of yourself you pushed into darkness long ago. This hidden reservoir is what Jung called the shadow. And here is the paradox. You cannot build real strength while rejecting parts of yourself. You cannot build real armor while at war with your own inner world. The observer allows you to see the shadow without fear. It becomes the torch that lights the basement of the psyche, revealing what has long been hidden. Without this light, the shadow acts without your awareness, sabotaging your relationships, coloring your judgments, amplifying your insecurities, and making external criticisms feel fatal. With the observer awakened, you can finally begin the work of reclaiming the parts of you that have been exiled. And until you reclaim them, external criticisms will always have the power to destroy you. The next chapter takes us deeper into this territory. We will explore why you reject certain traits within yourself, how the shadow forms, and why it continues to control you until you integrate it. Most importantly, we will understand why shadow integration is essential for building resilience that no external opinion can shatter. Integrating the shadow, reclaiming what you have rejected. You cannot build real psychological armor while you are secretly at war with yourself. This is one of Jung's most profound insights, and one of the hardest truths for people to accept. The parts of you that you fear, deny, hide, or reject do not disappear simply because you push them into the dark. They remain active forces in your psyche, shaping your behavior, influencing your reactions, distorting your perceptions, and amplifying your pain from the shadows. Jung called this hidden territory the shadow. Everything you believe you should not be, everything you were punished for being, and everything you decided must remain unseen if you are to be loved or accepted. Anger, jealousy, selfishness, desire, ambition, fear, laziness, insecurity, arrogance, every trait you judge as unacceptable was exiled to this inner basement. But the shadow does not die. It waits, and it seeps through the cracks of your controlled life in moments you do not expect. An emotional outburst, a sabotaged opportunity, a judgment you cast on someone else that reveals more about you than about them. This is because the shadow is not evil. It is simply unintegrated. And what is unintegrated controls you without your awareness. To understand how the shadow forms, imagine a child who expresses anger and is told, "Stop being bad." A child who cries and is told, "Stop being dramatic." A child who asserts themselves and is told, "You're too much." Little by little, the child learns which parts of themselves are welcomed and which parts must be hidden. They adapt to survive. They trade authenticity for safety, and the psyche begins to fracture. By adulthood, this person may seem composed, kind, humble, agreeable, or disciplined. But beneath the surface lies everything they suppressed. Anger that comes out sideways, jealousy disguised as moral concern, arrogance hidden behind self-deprecation, ambition masked by fear of failure. If they never look inward, they spend their life haunted by traits they believe belong to others, but are actually their own. This is why Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Your shadow shows itself most clearly in your projections. The person you call selfish may activate the part of you that was never allowed to prioritize yourself. The person you call arrogant may carry the confidence you were taught to suppress. The person you envy may embody the freedom you do not permit yourself to have. The person you judge may reflect the traits you cannot bear to admit live in you. The more fiercely you reject something in others, the more likely it is part of your disowned self. And here's the key. External criticism hurts most when it touches a part of your shadow. You feel destroyed not because the criticism is true, but because you have never made peace with that trait within yourself. A powerful exercise to begin shadow integration is simple but uncomfortable. Write down the words that wound you the most when used against you. Selfish, lazy, weak, stupid, arrogant, dramatic, needy. Then identify moments in your life where you have shown these qualities, not to punish yourself, but to recognize the truth. You are human, and these traits exist in all humans. The moment you acknowledge them honestly, the shame begins to dissolve. The criticism loses its venom. What you accept cannot destroy you. Integration does not mean indulging harmful behavior. It means taking ownership of your whole self, so that the unconscious no longer hijacks your life. Integrated anger becomes assertiveness. Integrated fear becomes caution with wisdom. Integrated ambition becomes purpose. Integrated vulnerability becomes connection. When you gather your rejected parts and bring them into consciousness, something extraordinary happens. You become whole. This wholeness becomes real strength. It is the armor that cannot crack, because it is not built by denying your humanity, but by embracing it. But shadow work is not the final stage. Even after integrating these hidden parts, people often remain vulnerable to internal attacks. Voices of criticism, doubt, and harsh judgment that echo from childhood. These voices are not your true self, but they have enormous influence until you confront them directly. To complete your armor, you must learn to face the inner critic, the ancient voice inside you that knows your deepest fears and uses them against you. Jung believed that engaging with this voice consciously, rather than obeying or avoiding it, is essential for individuation. That is the territory we enter next. It is time to descend into the mind's most intimate battlefield, the inner critic, the inner citadel, and the completion of your armor. There is a voice inside you that knows exactly where to strike. It speaks in the language of your deepest fears, your earliest wounds, your most painful memories. It appears in moments of vulnerability, ambition, or change. When you try to grow, it whispers, "Who do you think you are?" When you try to express yourself, it laughs, "You sound ridiculous." When you dare to hope, it warns, "Don't even try, you'll fail." This voice is the inner critic, and most people mistake it for their true self. They hear it so often with such authority that they assume its judgments must be reality. But Jung taught that the inner critic is not the self. It is a psychic fragment formed from the echoes of childhood. Harsh parents, demanding teachers, humiliating moments, comparisons, failures, traumas. It is a voice stuck in time, still trying to protect you using strategies that may have worked decades ago, but now only sabotage you. The inner critic is powerful precisely because it is familiar. Its tone resembles the voices you feared, sought approval from, or depended on. You swallowed these judgments before you had a fully formed ego to protect yourself. What was external became internal, and now it speaks as if it were your own mind. To silence this voice by force is impossible. Jung warned that what you resist intensifies. Suppressing the inner critic only drives it deeper, where it gains even more control. The key is not to fight it, but to face it consciously. This is where Jung's method of active imagination becomes essential. Instead of collapsing under the critic's words, you bring them into the light and ask, "Who is speaking inside me right now? What are you trying to protect me from? Where did you learn to speak this way? Why do you show up whenever I try to grow?" This transforms the critic from an unquestioned authority into a character, an entity you can observe, understand, and eventually integrate. Once personified, the critic begins to lose its absolute power. It ceases to be a dictator and becomes a wounded protector. You realize it is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to keep you safe in the only way it knows, by preventing you from taking risks that once felt dangerous. When you listen without obeying, something profound shifts. You become the center. You become the adult. You become the self that Jung described, the stable, conscious presence capable of holding all parts of your psyche without collapsing into them. This is a crucial step in the construction of psychological armor. But there is another essential element, the creation of a core identity, what Jung symbolically referred to as the inner citadel. This citadel is not built from praise, confidence, or external success. Those things change with circumstance. Instead, it is built from internal truths, simple, grounded realities about who you are at your best, proven by your own lived experience. Your citadel may include truths such as, "I return to integrity even after mistakes. I face challenges even when afraid. I am capable of learning and adapting. I honor my commitments. I have endured pain and continued forward. I care deeply even when unseen." These truths become the pillars of your identity. When criticism comes, you return to them. When doubt arises, you anchor yourself in them. When the inner critic attacks, you hold these truths like a shield. This is not delusion. It is evidence-based self-recognition. A fragile ego collapses under criticism because it has no center. A strong ego bends, reflects, considers, but remains intact. With a citadel at your core, external opinions no longer define you. They merely inform you. You gain the ability Jung considered the pinnacle of psychological development, the capacity to hold opposites without collapsing. You can hear criticism without feeling annihilated. You can acknowledge imperfection without shame. You can accept growth without fear. You can be vulnerable without breaking. This is the completion of your armor, not a rigid shell, but a flexible, living structure built from awareness, shadow integration, and conscious selfhood. It protects without isolating. It strengthens without hardening. It allows you to walk through the world open, receptive, resilient, and whole. You began this journey believing sensitivity was a flaw. You now understand it was a signal, a call to build the structure you were never taught to build. With the observer awakened, the shadow integrated, the inner critic confronted, and the inner citadel formed, you step into a new way of being. Not untouched by life, but unbroken by it. Not hardened, but whole. This is the armor that does not crack. This is the self that does not collapse. This is the life you are now ready to live.